Our next speaker is Dr. David Marples. Dr. Marples is Professor of History and Director of the Stashuk Program on Contemporary Ukraine at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. He's the author of numerous books on Chernobyl, including the book which you received at this symposium. So Dr. Marples will be speaking on the topic of the economic, social, and political consequences of the Chernobyl disaster. Dr. Marples.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I might apologize for my disheveled appearance, and that's because normally I shave in the morning, and today I got to get up at 3 o'clock in Detroit, or somewhere close to Detroit, in order to make the flight here. So if I look a little bit out of shape, that's probably because I am. Nevertheless, what I'll try to do today is to give an overview rather than focus in great detail upon any particular issue. And therefore, this is called Chernobyl in Perspective. The Chernobyl disaster has given rise to numerous analyses and reports, scientific and journalistic, as well as films and documentaries. It has been the subject of widespread and unresolved debate as to the number of victims, the current medical effects, and the impact of low-level radiation on people's health. It has reflected a rift between various parts of the scientific community, as well as between that same community and popular writing and inquiries. It has receded from world attention over time. In fact, it is generally now only commemorated in the West on major anniversaries. But its effects are still with us. In some respects, partly as a result of natural decomposition of radionuclides, and partly as a consequence of economic factors, the situation has worsened rather than improved over time. And in Belarus, a presidential dictator has decreed that the contaminated lands are now fit for rehabilitation and the cultivation of crops. And in fact, in many parts there, the farmers have lived off the land for the past 20 years with scant attention to what they are eating. Last September, a consortium called the Chernobyl Forum, including a number of UN organizations headed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, as well as certain branches of the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian governments, issued a new report totaling some 600 pages in length, which claimed to offer a definitive account of the disaster and its consequences. The press release of the report offered several main conclusions. Up to 4,000 people, it said, could eventually die from radiation exposure, but by mid-2005, the death toll from Chernobyl-induced radiation stood at less than 50. 2,200 deaths could be expected among 200,000 cleanup workers working at the site in 1986-87. Because of the changing pattern of radionuclide breakdown, the emergency zones designated in the 1980s need to be redefined, and the worst health impact to date has been the outbreak of thyroid gland cancer among 4,000 children, but this has resulted in only 9 deaths. The Forum report maintains that the greatest enemies today to those living in areas contaminated by Chernobyl are poverty and difficulties caused by relocation. In turn, the stresses induced by the events have led to a decline in mental health, and the chief dilemma currently, therefore, is psychological toll. The feeling that Chernobyl is the cause of all problems has also led, the report says, to a dependency on the state rather than self-help and local initiatives, and it has led the Forum to criticize those Chernobyl-related programs that it considers enhance rather than reduce this dependency. Overall, said spokesperson Michael Repicoli, quote, "The sum total of the Chernobyl Forum is a reassuring message," end of quote. In April 2006, Greenpeace issued an alternative report that disputed many of the findings of the Chernobyl Forum, and which was based largely on contributions from scientists at government institutions of Ukraine, and to a lesser extent Russia, and with one contributor from Belarus. This account focuses exclusively on health effects. Concerning the Forum total of 4,000 additional deaths from Chernobyl, it claims that in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine alone, the accident caused, quote, "an estimated 200,000 additional deaths between 1999 and 2004. It adds that cancers are frequent in the affected areas and among the liquidators, including leukemia. In Belarus, it cites a 40% rise in cancers between 1990 and 2000, but in the contaminated regions, such as Homel Oblast, the increase was over 50%. The incidence of thyroid gland cancer in the highly irradiated Bryansk region, it claims, is double that of Russia as a whole over the decade 1988 to 98, and by 2004 was triple the national average. Overall, it states that there will be a possible 90,000 additional cases of mortalities from cancers, as well as other related diseases of the thyroid gland among thousands of victims in the 3 most affected countries. It claims that children under the age of 4 at the time of the accident are particularly susceptible to thyroid gland cancer. And it documents cases of the significant increase of incidence of diseases of the respiratory, digestive, blood vascular, musculoskeletal systems, abnormalities of the immune system, including a study of 4,000 men in Belarus exposed to small doses of radiation over the long term, as well as congenital infections, genetic abnormalities, and premature aging. The Greenpeace report comments that the reasons for the discrepancies between the Chernobyl Forum report and its own should be investigated with some urgency, and that research into the impact of Chernobyl 20 years on needs to be increased. Why is it that such discrepancies exist 20 years later? It's an interesting fact that there's the widespread participation of many well-known scientists in the Greenpeace report, and this disavowal of the Chernobyl Forum report by these same scientists, despite the claim that the Chernobyl Forum report was approved by the 3 major governments concerned. It seems that science is not monolithic, and in the case of Chernobyl, there is no one set of correct answers or forecasts. The most significant aspect of the disaster, which I'll mention in a moment, is surely the secrecy surrounding the initial crucial stages. So in order to comprehend the situation better, my paper will examine the background to the accident now, then explain how it was interpreted and the initial steps taken at the national and international levels. It began as a Soviet event that within 5 years became a national one in Ukraine and Belarus in particular, but the 2 republics, as well as Russia, approached the disaster in very different ways. The Soviet nuclear power program focused on 2 main reactor types. Its favored choice was the RBMK, a graphite and water moderated reactor which had been diverted from its use in the atomic weapons program from the mid-1950s. Hence the predominance in the early days of the accident of officials from the Atomic Weapons Ministry, the Ministry of Medium Machine Building. The RBMK can be refueled online, thus saving valuable time, but it suffers from numerous defects. According to the KGB documents in Ukraine that were released in 2003, and cover the period from 1971 to 1987, there were at least 30 major defects known in the RBMK reactor before the disaster happened. Among those defects are a positive void coefficient, meaning that the reactor becomes unstable if operated at low power, and has no significant containment above the reactor, like, for example, the graphite-moderated plants in Canada. Its prototype was the station at Sosnovy Bor, near St. Petersburg, or Leningrad then. And stations were also constructed at Kursk, Chornobyl, and a new generation started up at Ignalina in Lithuania. There was also a station under construction in Smolensk in western Russia. The alternative reactor, and the one used for export, as well as domestic electricity production, was the water-pressurized, or VVER reactor, which can be found across Eastern Europe, as well as in places like Vietnam, Mongolia, and Cuba, and the prototype was the Soviet reactor base at Novovoronezh. The site for Chernobyl was chosen in 1970 on the left bank of the Pripyat River, and the first reactor came online in October 1977. In the building of the first two reactors, partly as a result of the haste of the program and the adoption to a rigid timetable, there were frequent problems. In the year 1978 alone, the time when Unit 2 came into service, 170 workers were injured in accidents at the site. Between 1981 and 1985, there were over 1,000 emergency shutdowns at Soviet nuclear power stations, including 381 at the RBMKs and over 100 at Chernobyl itself. At the nuclear power station at Rivne in western Ukraine, there was said to be no adequate disposal site for low-level nuclear waste, while the containment over the reactor was insufficient to contain the release of radioactive substances in the event of an accident. In general, nearly all these problems, which actually occupied every building site at the time, were blamed on the factories who manufactured the equipment. At Chernobyl, 4 reactors, each 1,000 megawatts, were in service by 1984, and 2 others were at different stages of completion. Unit 5, which was the subject of heightened anxiety in the KGB documents, was at 80% completion, and Unit 6 at 15%. The reactors were built in twin sets, 1 and 2 built together, 3 and 4 together, and 5 and 6 were some distance from the main station. On the 9th of September 1982, there was a serious accident at Chernobyl's first reactor unit prior to a scheduled shutdown. The exact causes are not known, but one of the reactor channels ruptured when power was raised to 20%. At first, the authorities in Moscow saw no cause for panic. The accident, it said, had been contained and no one had been injured. Within several days, however, the reports became more alarmist, and it was revealed that significant amounts of radiation had escaped the plant's confines. A top-secret report from the Ukrainian KGB to Ukrainian Party Secretary Szczerbitsky noted that areas had been contaminated at a distance 14 kilometers northeast of the plant and 5 kilometers to the southwest. Among the settlements badly affected by this earlier accident were Chisto Halivka, which was one of the villages evacuated immediately after the Chernobyl accident. No one knew, however, that it had actually been contaminated twice. The documents on the 1982 accident soon fell silent. A government commission was appointed to investigate it, but its conclusions, and even whether it actually met, are not known. Neither the Soviet public nor the international community was ever informed about the 1982 accident. In 1982, the International Atomic Energy Agency had never yet inspected a Soviet civilian nuclear power station. But the 1982 accident was to set the precedent for the behavior and actions of the Soviet authorities in April 1986. This is just a general map, by the way, of the area around Chernobyl, and you can see the large Kiev reservoir at the bottom, the main water supply for the city of Kiev. And the big fear, of course, from Chernobyl was the contamination of that water supply. The intricate details of the Chernobyl accident will not be elaborated in this talk. So suffice it to say that a repeated experiment occurred at the time of a shutdown to see how long a spinning turbine could continue to generate power before emergency turbines came into operation. An inexperienced operator tried to raise the power of the reactor, causing a power surge that blew the roof off the fourth reactor unit at 01:23 on the morning of 26th of April. The resulting radioactive debris reached a height of around 1 kilometer, and for the next 2 weeks, radiation continued to escape through the gaping hole, with an estimated 260 million curies entering the atmosphere before the hole was plugged on the 10th of May. The initial explosion released only a few hundred kilograms of particles. The rest of the releases, initially believed to be about 3% of the contents of the core, although some more recent works suggest at least 6% of the contents, but they were released over the following days as a result of the reactor fire. The radiation cloud that had been formed was transported by the wind in a northwesterly direction, so that major fallout occurred on the territory of Belarus, the border of which is only 10 kilometers from the Chernobyl station. The initial danger was the spread of a graphite fire to the roof of the third reactor unit. The safety tests had been conducted by 2 operators, neither of which was expert in nuclear physics, and under the jurisdiction of the deputy chief engineer. And it was said that there were 17 shift workers, but not the plant manager or the chief engineer, present for the test. Informing both the public and the outside world occurred very slowly. The first announcement came on the 28th of April on Radio Moscow, but only after nuclear plant workers in Sweden detected high levels of radiation on their shoes entering their own plant to start work. So they set off the alarms, in other words, in the plant in Sweden. The Swedes thus realized that an accident had occurred somewhere in the Soviet Union. The Politburo set up an operative group under Mikhail Gorbachev's 2 key officials, Yegor Ligachov, the ideology secretary, and Nikolai Ryzhkov, his prime minister. And these leaders then set up links with various ministries of key import for a nuclear accident, such as the Union Ministry of Health and the State Committee for Hydrometeorology and Environmental Control. Meanwhile, the first, more detailed reports appeared in the printed media on the 29th of April, that is particularly in Ukraine, and this was 3 days after the disaster occurred. They repeated the figure of 2 dead, but gave few other details. If people in Belarus had not listened to Radio Moscow, it would have been a week before they knew anything about the Chernobyl disaster. The graphite fire continued to burn, eliciting the arrival of fire crews from Pripyat and Kiev, 80 miles to the south, all of which had to come via a single road. And helicopters began to drop lead, boron, and sand onto the reactor to quash the fire. The initial evacuation area was designated at 10-kilometer radius around the reactor, meaning that the main areas to be evacuated were the town for reactor workers, Pripyat, with a population of 45,000, and Chernobyl itself, a small town of 10,000 people. But they were told that they were being evacuated for 3 days and to take belongings for that amount of time. Up to that point, in the town of Pripyat, especially on the morning of the 26th of April, life continued basically as normal. Men went fishing, and 2 weddings were held outdoors on the same day that the Chernobyl disaster occurred. Farmers were reported as burning their feet on the soil, and no health warnings or even advice to stay indoors was given to local residents. A government commission was established under Boris Jabina and took control at the Chornobyl site. On the 2nd of May 1986, Ligachev and Ryzhkov flew to Chornobyl and promptly expanded the evacuation zone to 30 kilometers. Between the 2nd and 4th of May, 60,000 people were reportedly evacuated. The early and most serious victims were taken to hospitals in Moscow, the Specialized Clinic No. 6, and Kiev. By 4th of May, it was reported to the Politburo that 1,882 people had been hospitalized, including 204 seriously afflicted with radiation sickness. These totals soon increased substantially. On the 1st of May, over the reactor, radiation levels were reportedly 80 röntgens per hour. 3 days later, a change in the direction of the wind led to a dramatic rise in the radiation background in the city of Kiev, with a population of 2.5 million. And by 8th of May at the reactor site, the levels were still rising, reaching 1,000 röntgens per hour, or 77,000 times the background norm. The accounts from the KGB comment on 2 explosions, the second of which was the most powerful and destroyed all the fire extinguishing equipment. As the radiation cloud formed over the reactor, the lack of Geiger counters rendered it impossible to take accurate readings of radiation levels, raising suspicion, of course, concerning all the reported totals during this period. The KGB role was to investigate the causes and assign responsibility for the accident. But it also concentrated on things like the need to control traffic in and out of the zone and on the busy road from Kiev. By late May, the key priority was the construction of the temporary roof, the sarcophag over the destroyed reactor, and the construction of a cable pathway for the delivery of building materials. A key concern was that dropping materials on the graphite fire had actually served to push the reactor downward, threatening to contaminate the water table. So coal miners were brought in to construct a concrete shelf under the reactor in order that the Pripyat and Uz rivers did not get contaminated. Other priorities were the collection and burial of radioactive deposits, starting with the roof of Units 3 and 4, and the removal of the so-called Red Forest close to the site, which was critically contaminated. The contaminated zone was divided by the Government Commission mainly according to the fallout of cesium-137, one of the more long-term radionuclides. The worst affected area with cesium, the area over 40 curies per square kilometre in the soil, was designated as a zone of alienation and projected to remain empty for several decades. There was a zone of compulsory evacuation between 15 and 40 curies, a zone of permanent control with the right to evacuation at 5 to 15 curies, and all the area with more than 1 curie per square kilometre in the soil of cesium had to be constantly monitored. In this early period, approximately 118,400 people were evacuated from the zones, but often to areas that fell into the same path that the radioactive cloud took, and therefore they had to be moved a second time. These zones were also somewhat arbitrary in that a single farmer's field could fall into all 4 zones at the same time, depending on where the measurement was taken. By the year 2000, over 350,400 had been evacuated, with the largest portion moved in the period 1991 to 2000. About 163,000 people were evacuated from Ukraine altogether, 135,000 from Belarus, and over 52,000 from Russia. I hope all these sounds aren't anything to do with me, by the way. I keep hearing squeak. It seems like it's coming out of my ear, you know. So these above events might constitute a normal response to an emergency, But the Soviet Union was not a normal society, and in several respects the response to Chernobyl leads to several questions. The cleanup operation, for example, which involved more than 600,000 people, was conducted in appalling conditions, with terms in the zone extended without warning, lifetime levels of radiation exceeded frequently, and overexposure to radiation was very common, especially on the reactor roof. There was also a lack of facilities that could have been alleviated with a better response to offers of assistance from help abroad. Geiger counters often didn't work beyond the level of 25 rems, but when that level was reached, workers simply remained in the zone without the Geiger counter. In the first few weeks after the disaster, volunteers came from republics all over the Soviet Union to help at Chernobyl. When they were eventually replaced by military reservists, they were never registered officially, but simply disappeared from the national lists. It is known today that many of these early workers at Chernobyl subsequently died. Yesterday, for example, it was reported from Kazakhstan that of more than 30,000 cleanup workers originally at Chernobyl in 1986 to 88, only 6,000 are alive today. A staggering statistic, no matter what one considers might have been the cause of their deaths. However, they do not appear on the official list of victims of Chernobyl. There were many others in those first days who subsequently died. One was the Ukrainian film director, Volodymyr Shevchenko, who died after making a film at Chernobyl in the first days of the accident. Health data were in any case classified, and once the reservists arrived, all casualties were closely guarded by the USSR Defense Ministry. When deaths did occur, they were attributed to illnesses such as vegetovascular dystonia. No one who fell ill and died during this period died officially as a result of Chernobyl. By the spring of 1989, partly as a result of glasnost, maps appeared in the Soviet media indicating that the area of radiation fallout was much broader than first reported. So hundreds of Soviet families suddenly discovered that they were living in a radioactive zone, particularly in Belarus and Ukraine. And the reaction can only be imagined, and it led to demands for further and more controversial evacuations. I put a couple of maps up here of the fallout from radiation. It's not particularly clear, but this is simply of Belarus, and you can see the radiation moving to the northwest and the north in the first couple of days, and then with the change of wind direction, moving back down south. And it was that same wind that eventually blew the radiation cloud over the city of Kiev. And a more general map frequently used for radiation, the darker the level, the higher the contamination. The over 40 curies is the darkest of the red of cesium. And this fallout belt spread very widely in those three republics as well as most of Europe. And just for the record, since I took these photographs myself, these are taken from the Chernobyl plant. This, of course, is not the fourth reactor unit, it's the number 2 unit. And this is, of course, a typical control room at the Chernobyl number 2 reactor. Despite the later evacuations, the damage had essentially been done, as radioactive food had been consumed, delivered locally and at distance, and even exported for the previous 3 years. This combination of secrecy and distortions at a time when the Politburo knew many of the details about the impact of the disaster but chose not to disclose them, has been termed by Alla Yaroshinskaya, a former Soviet deputy from Zhytomyr region of Ukraine, as, quote, the big lie. And Yaroshinskaya was to rescue many of these documents for posterity in late 1991. Even the acclaimed Soviet report to the IAEA in Vienna in August 1986 about the causes of the accident went no further than attributing it to human error, ignoring the well-known defects in the RBMK reactor. In fact, the isolation of all decision-making for the nuclear industry in Moscow and Gorbachev's decision to use Chernobyl as a form of state propaganda for his anti-nuclear weapons program led to virtual paralysis in Kiev and Minsk. Incidentally, on the second anniversary of Chernobyl, the leader of the Soviet delegation to Vienna, Valery Legasov, committed suicide. And in some of his notes published posthumously, he indicates his disillusionment with the way the Soviet nuclear industry was being operated. By the late 1980s also, the USSR faced a financial and political crisis that undermined its efforts to deal adequately with the aftermath of Chernobyl. In addition to Soviet culpability for many of the problems that resulted, there was also a lot of speculation about the real consequences, and no doubt exaggerated reports appeared in several media, including in the West. Radiophobia, as it was called, led to many stories, such as the belief that the application of red wine and vodka was the best cure for radiation sickness. But in turn, beliefs like that were a result of official silence, major Freudian slip there, and lack of information from the authorities. But who were the political victims of Chernobyl? First of all, the Minister of Medium Machine Building was dismissed from his post. But I don't place much importance on that because he was 88 years old at the time. In the summer of 1987, the plant director, Viktor Brikhanov, along with his chief engineer, deputy chief engineer, and operators were put on trial in the town of Chernobyl itself. Brikhanov received a sentence of 10 years of hard labor, which was somewhat harsh given the fact that he wasn't actually at the plant at the time of the experiment. However, he was castigated for, quote-unquote, lying about the real radiation levels at the station, lowering the totals by dozens of times. Glasnost also spawned political opposition in Ukraine, including the environmental movement Zeleny Svit, or Green World, led by the medical doctor Yuri Shcherbak, initially formed in late 1987. By early 1989, Ukraine had its own popular movement for perestroika, or perebudova, I guess I should say, and its founding congress was held in September of that year. And it was influenced quite substantially by the secrecy over Chernobyl, and led by three members of the Union of Writers, Dmytro Pavlichko, Ivan Drach, and Volodymyr Yavorivsky. And RUK soon began to demand an end to the nuclear power program in Ukraine, as well as Ukrainian sovereignty over industrial installations and its own economy, eventually achieved in the summer of 1990. And it's a great pity, of course, that Yuri couldn't be here with us today. He's done an awful lot of traveling, and I think we owe him an awful lot in terms of information gained about Chernobyl, because he was another one who carried out extensive interviews in the first days afterward. It looks exactly the same today, only he's a little bit heavier. Chernobyl initially didn't really affect the nuclear power program. All three reactors at Chernobyl were back online by December of 1987. Eventually, the workers who were evacuated from Pripyat were to be rehoused in a new city built about 40 miles to the northeast of Chernobyl called Slavutich. I often like to think, for you Ukrainians present, that it was named after a famous Alberta professor, Yahya Slavutich. I think he thinks that too, by the way. But the International Atomic Energy Agency supervised several improvements at the Chernobyl plant itself, including an increase of the uranium enrichment, and also the safety rules were improved so that no one could switch off safety devices during a major experiment, and no experiment could take place in future without the director and the chief engineer being present. Classic case of shutting the stable door after all the animals have gone. In 1994, and don't ask me why there was such a delay, the International Atomic Energy Agency decided that Chernobyl was an unsafe plant and that the RBMK reactor was inherently dangerous, and from that point on advised the Ukrainian authorities to close down Chernobyl as soon as possible. This was a photograph I took right outside the Chernobyl plant, and you can see really this is June 1989, but there's not really much in terms of protective clothing being worn. Actually, next to the signs of the danger radiation, cleanup workers were sitting there with their backs to the sign smoking cigarettes. A friend of mine who works, by the way, for the German magazine Stern, Mario Dederichs, actually has a photograph of a similar thing before the cover is over the reactor. In other words, the open reactor in the background and workers sitting outside smoking cigarettes and eating their lunch, which is incredible. Chernobyl had a devastating environmental effect on Ukraine and Belarus, contaminating respectively about 8 and 22% of the landmass and 22% of the entire forests of Belarus, and also polluted a very large area of Russia, including Smolensk and Bryansk regions. There are more than 5 million people currently residing in areas with more than 1 curie per square kilometer of cesium in the soil. In Ukraine, the long-term impact of cesium, strontium, and plutonium, with a half-life of 24,000 years, will continue in perpetuity in Kiev, Zhytomyr, and Chernihiv regions, as well as parts of Volyn and Rivne oblasts. And in Belarus, the most affected regions are Homel, Mohyliov, and Brest. Many villages of the Homel region of Belarus have been depopulated. Others subsist, living in poverty, but virtually no young people remain. During harvesting, university students are being sent here to assist as an obligatory part of their curriculum. Though the 4th reactor unit was covered by the fall of 1986, it began to erode after 15 years, and a German-French consortium designed a new roof of more permanent construction. But as we'll later hear today, there's been new developments on the so-called shelter implementation plan. The environmental movement that was inspired by Chernobyl led to an anti-nuclear backlash across the Soviet Union and the abandonment of various half-completed projects, including reactor sites at Chehirin and Crimea in Ukraine. In 1990, the Ukrainian government introduced a 5-year moratorium on the commissioning of any more nuclear reactors in Ukraine. And in Belarus, where things always happen later, a 10-year moratorium was imposed in 1998. The casualty levels from Chernobyl may never be accurately known. The figure of less than 50 dead, or earlier 31 dead, probably should not be taken seriously. The number of healthy children was reported as 80% in the mid-1980s in what are today Chernobyl zones, but today is less than 20%. And it's considerably lower than in the clean zones. In Belarus, as a result of Chernobyl, 1.5 million people are currently under medical observation, which is over 15% of the population, including over 330,000 children. And liquidators have suffered a variety of ailments. Many committed suicide. At least 5,000 were dead by 1990. And according to the Greenpeace report, in Ukraine alone, 34,000 have died already. The difficulty here is corroborating the results. But it's plain that liquidators, evacuees, and current zone residents face a variety of health problems that have resulted from Chernobyl, in addition to a fall of living standards, a lack of nutrition, and the sort of psychological stress cited in the Chernobyl Forum report. Overall, the number of people declared to be suffering from the Chernobyl accident in the territories of the former Soviet Union in December 2000 was 7.1 million. And of that figure, 4.5 million were residents of contaminated regions, over 500,000 liquidators at the scene in 1988 to 89, and over 350,000 evacuees. And if you break down those figures between the different republics, It's over 3 million in Ukraine, over 2 million in Russia, and 1.82 million in Belarus. And thyroid gland cancer began to surface among children by 1989, having been practically unknown in that age group before that. And in Belarus now there have been several deaths reported among those on whom surgery was performed. Even levels of leukemia have risen throughout the contaminated zone, and the levels are in the upper limit of the European norms. But I'll just give one brief example of the difficulty of examining Chernobyl in Belarus, that of Yuri Bandazhevsky, a nuclear specialist and former rector of the Homel Medical Institute, who carried out a study of the incidence of cardiovascular disease among children. He concluded that relatively low subjection to cesium could cause cataracts, heart disease, and other maladies. He was also critical of the sale of radioactive vegetables and maintained that the contaminated region around Chernobyl was increasing over time. However, in the midst of his research, in July 1999, he was jailed by the Lukashenko regime, initially for, quote, anti-state terrorism, and later accused of embezzling funds at his university institute. When he was released quite recently, he was in broken health. How am I doing for time, anyone? Is there a Obersturmbannführer who can tell me how long I've got left? I'm okay. Okay, very good. I'm not used to this, you know. I once attended a conference where they gave me 10 minutes and didn't think it was adequate. This is a photograph of one of the firemen who was first took part in the battle at Chernobyl, so-called, against the graphite fire. And 3 years later, he was still in this condition at the Center for Radiation Medicine in Kiev. There were several firemen there, all of them still too sick to work. The serious health dilemmas that have resulted from Chernobyl have led some scientists to question figures from the Chernobyl Forum report. According to one of them, the number of thyroid gland cancers among children today is actually over 10,000 rather than the 4,000 cited in the report, which has implications for the long-term mortality rate. Though the report acknowledges a significant rise in the various types of cancer among liquidators and of breast cancer among women living in the zone, it doesn't contain anything about the apparent lack of immunity to diseases among the population generally. There is information about the apparent link between radiation and the increase of newborn children with abnormalities, but some critics have noted that the report is really contradicting itself in some ways. For example, it states that there can be no precision and no precise number regarding the total future deaths from Chernobyl, then goes on to state that in Russia there will be an additional 4,726 deaths. Some of the language also in that report is fairly nebulous, with phrases like "it is possible," "not definitively," "not altogether clearly," "not corroborated by statistical data." Perhaps a more serious accusation is that the direct links between radiation and increased stress may be confirmed by a study in France. The report essentially, though, ignores the long-term impact of Chernobyl and long-term cancers outside those three major countries of concern, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. But in fact, Chernobyl affected in a very large way almost all of Europe. So these countries constitute only a small fraction of the overall fallout area. And I'll just whip through a few photographs. This is the Ferris wheel at Pripyat. This was never actually ridden on. It was a brand new wheel. And this is a photograph of the irradiated seeds from the red forest growing in the greenhouse at Pripyat. the director of this greenhouse offered me some tomatoes to take back to Canada with me. And I was foolish enough to take one, which exploded in my suitcase, actually. And my suitcase then got lost by Air Canada somewhere between Paris and Montreal with the irradiated tomato, which destroyed most of my clothing, by the way, and my wife then threw it away. And the red forest around Chernobyl, which has now all been removed. So some conclusions. In the year 2000, the Ukrainian government of Leonid Kuchma closed the Chernobyl station permanently in the hope that the output of the 2 remaining reactors could be offset by the commissioning with Western aid of new reactors at Khmelnytsky, number 2, and Rivne, number 4, both VVER-1000s. There are today over 100 radioactive waste burial sites in the zone, many of which cannot be described as safe or permanent. And as described by Mary Mizio, the zone has effectively become depopulated today and a virtual wildlife park. After 20 years, there's no consensus on health effects, and the accident has caused a rift between the scientific establishment, with the Chernobyl Forum report on the one hand, as I mentioned, and the Greenpeace on the other. The accident has a profound impact on Ukrainian national development and in raising national consciousness, and concomitantly anti-Moscow sentiment. It's often suggested today that Chernobyl was the real reason why the Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1991. According to a recent survey, Chernobyl is still a major concern in Ukraine today, as one would expect it would be. It doesn't rank first, according to this survey, it ranks 4th after low income, unemployment, and crime. But also significantly, this same poll reveals that more than 64% in Ukraine believe nuclear power to be dangerous or very dangerous as a form of energy production. And only 7% have any faith in the governments concerning nuclear safety. In Belarus, Chernobyl is identified primarily with the campaigns of the political opposition. On the 26th of April, the Chernobyl March, a traditional event that draws large crowds in Minsk, resulted in the arrest and detention of one of the major opposition candidates for the presidential election, Alexander Milinkevich. The government has also criticized summer programs abroad for Chernobyl children, but at the same time recently took credit for all the programs introduced in Chernobyl since 1990. The health crisis that occurred in Belarus elicited the convocation of the first Congress of Doctors in 1998, which noted a rise in the incidence of sickness generally by 32% in Belarus between 1990 and 1997, and a 50-fold rise in the number of children with thyroid gland cancer. So 20 years later, the legacy of Chernobyl lives on in Ukraine and Belarus in particular. Newly independent states succeeded the Soviet republics, but faced overwhelming economic problems. In Ukraine, the total costs by the year 2000 were estimated at $128 billion, and in Belarus, the costs over the same period around $235 billion. 20 years on, over 10,000 young people have cancer, and thousands of liquidators are dead from causes that may or may not be linked to Chernobyl, but their deaths are nonetheless premature. Even the populations of those two republics, like those of Russia, are in steep decline. The population of Belarus has gone down by 500,000 since 1985, and Ukraine has suffered one of the most catastrophic population losses, even since independence, of 4.5 million people. The lack of fertility among these populations and the mass migrations from the Chernobyl regions both seem to be linked directly to the 1986 disaster. So the world has now moved on to new crises such as the war in Iraq, famine in Africa, and the danger of nuclear weapons being manufactured in rogue states like North Korea. But today, 20 years later, there's no closure on Chernobyl, no foreseeable end to the debate, and no relief from the profound medical, social, and psychological burden placed on the 7 million people living with its effects in the soil and in the food chain today. Thank you.